thank you very much for inviting me here today to talk about our project about the Jewish community in Sussex and its experience in the First World War. I think what I'm going to say is going to follow on very nicely from what Anne's talked about in Eastbourne, because the area that I'm talking about along the south coast is quite similar. So, as I mentioned, as you mentioned in the introduction, this was a volunteer-based project funded by the National Lottery, and we looked at the lives of 50 individuals from across East and West Sussex. And our initial focus was on Brighton, which was the home to the largest Jewish community in the county at the time. And we also looked at the lives of people living in both directions along the coast, from Chichester in the west along to Hastings in the east. And we also researched a group of wealthy individuals living in the countryside in the centre of the county near Horsham and Crawley. So I'm going to start by looking at what life was like in Brighton before the First World War. So there had been a Jewish community in Brighton from at least 1780. And by the Edwardian period, the community was several hundred strong, with additional visitors coming during the summer months. Successful and well-established Jewish families were making an impact on the social, political and physical fabric of the town. For example, if you arrived in Brighton by train, you passed through the station designed by the Jewish architect David McCatter. If you walked down to the seafront, you'd come to the Palace Pier, which was completed by the entrepreneur John Howard. And if you stepped back from the seafront, there'd be areas of small shops and businesses that were once the heart of Jewish life in the town centre and around the Middle Street Synagogue, which you can see here on the right. And the Middle Street Synagogue was opened in 1875, and this beautiful building was endowed by the Sassoon and Montefiore families, amongst others, and was central to our project. Michael Crook of the Jewish Historical Society of England very kindly allowed us access to the congregation's minutes for the period of the First World War, and Michael's own research was very helpful in the project. And in particular, we based our initial research on the synagogue's memorial tablet, which you can see on the right. And this lists the names of 125 local Jewish men who served in the forces during the First World War, 6 of whom died. However, the memorial is not a complete record because it only commemorates people directly to the linked to the synagogue. And our research suggests that over 20 Jewish men with a connection to Brighton and Sussex died during the First World War. And of course, the war was to have profound consequences for the whole of the community. And I'm going to take, just as one example, the Marks family. On the top left is Barnet Marks, who was a jeweller and pawnbroker. He was very active in civic and social life. He was a magistrate and a councillor for over 40 years. And in 1910, he became the first Jewish mayor of Hove, with his wife Pauline as his mayoress. Barnet served as a trustee of the Middle Street Synagogue, and its rabbi at the time, the Reverend Jacobs, spoke at his inauguration as mayor. With the coming of hostilities, Barnet took on several wartime committee roles, including helping refugees and overseeing war pension payments. The couple's 2 sons, Albert and Arthur, both enlisted in the local Royal Sussex Regiment. Fortunately, the younger son, Albert, survived the war. However, the older son, Arthur, was wounded in France and suffered from shell shock. He recovered in hospital in Britain, and was given a desk job on the War Savings Committee. But unfortunately, in October 1918, he died in hospital from pneumonia. And it's possible that he was a casualty of what we now call the Spanish flu epidemic, which raged in 1918 and 1919 and actually killed more people worldwide than the war. And this has been one of the surprises of our project. We weren't looking to find evidence of this epidemic, but it turned up as a factor almost straight away. In fact, our project has come across 5 of its victims, and in Brighton as a whole, over 500 people died. The synagogue was involved in the war in other ways too, as its rabbi served at the front, and this is him here on the left, the Reverend Lieberman. At the outbreak of war, he was a relatively young man and had only just taken over at the Middle Street Synagogue and just got married. But in December 1916, Major Lionel de Rothschild wrote to the synagogue on behalf of the Jewish War Services Committee, asking them to release their minister so that he could act as a chaplain in France to the Jewish forces. And Rothschild suggested that Lieberman was the best man available for the job. The council members agreed and raised Reverend Lieberman's salary while he was in the military. And in fact, he was one of over 20 Jewish chaplains that served during the war so that soldiers could continue their religious duties and so that people could be buried properly. Fortunately, Reverend Lieberman survived the war and returned to serve the Brighton and Hove congregation, and he was later acting chairman of the Board of Jewish Deputies in 1948. I'm going to move further along the coast now to Worthing, and on the left we have Joshua Cancino. Like about a quarter of the people that we studied in our project, Joshua was born abroad in Morocco, and that's where his father was a shipping agent, and Joshua was born to the British community there as both his parents were British subjects. As a boy, Joshua's family moved to Manchester, where Joshua completed a degree, and then he moved to the continent to do a master's degree in chemistry. In 1916, he married his wife Beryl and moved to her hometown of Worthing on the Sussex coast. He also enlisted in the Royal Sussex Regiment and was killed while serving in France. He had been trying to rescue a wounded officer who was entangled in barbed wire and was described as having performed a splendid deed in the face of almost certain death. Like many soldiers, Joshua has no known grave, but he is commemorated on the Thiepval Memorial in France. And the death of this promising young scientist must have come as a blow to all those who knew him. He is commemorated in 2 synagogues in Manchester and in London, and on Manchester University's War Memorial, and on the Worthing Municipal Memorial on the right-hand side of the screen. And the Worthing Memorial was paid for in the name of Joshua's young daughter, Jocelyn, who was born 5 months after her father was killed. However, it wasn't just men who were sent abroad. Increased freedoms for women led to a number of nurses and doctors serving on the continent. One of these was Florence Oppenheimer, who, overcoming opposition from her father, trained as a nurse at the Royal Sussex Hospital in Brighton in 1911. In 1915, she sailed on a hospital ship to the Middle East. While it was actually quite pleasant in the quiet times, conditions on board could be very, very difficult indeed when the injured came aboard, and sometimes there was only one member of medical staff for 200 patients. However, she must have coped very well because in 1916 she was mentioned in dispatches for her distinguished service in the field. After the war, she married Leopold Greenberg, the editor of the Jewish Chronicle, and became a well-known writer on Jewish cookery under the name of Florence Greenberg. I'm now going to turn to the impact of the war on the home front. So the war's most immediate impact on the south coast was the arrival of refugees from Belgium in 1914. Hundreds of Belgian refugees sought shelter in Brighton, and significant efforts were made across different religious groups to help them. In 1914, Ernest Schiff came to speak to the council members of the Brighton and Hove Hebrew congregation. And Ernest Schiff was a worker on behalf of Jewish refugees, and he spoke of the plight of thousands of homeless people in London. A committee was formed, and the synagogue raised £100, equivalent to around £10,000 today, to help with the refugee support effort. And they helped in other ways as well. So, for example, employment was found for a family of Jewish diamond cutters who had fled from Antwerp. And we've also heard a little from Anne that the war led to internal migration within the UK, which changed the composition of the Jewish community in Sussex. So families moved to Brighton and Sussex from places that were considered at greater risk of bombing or invasion. For example, the Samuels family moved from Westcliff-on-Sea to Hove. And on arrival in Hove, Mr. Samuels established a minyan at his home to serve the increasing number of Jewish people in the area. And this westward expansion may have helped plant the seed for the establishment of the Hove congregation after the war. A second really important factor for Sussex was the large numbers of wounded soldiers who were repatriated to Britain for treatment. There were 12 military hospitals in Brighton, including the famous Brighton Pavilion, which was turned into a hospital, and over 12,000 Indian soldiers recuperated in the town. In this environment, it was unfortunate that a number of philanthropists came forward from the Jewish community. Among the donors was Fanny Bonato, down here at the bottom left, the widow of the millionaire diamond dealer. Sorry, I've forgotten his name, Mr. Bonato. And Fanny equipped a hospital in a building that was lent by a person in the centre here, Osmond Davidor Goldsmith. Osmond also lent another house to be used as a specialist hospital to treat shell shock. And I've recently heard that his sister was also involved in the war effort. His sister Bernice had a senior role both in the British Red Cross and also in the Women's Royal Naval Service. And we believe that she taught women to drive ambulances. And then Sir John Howard endowed Brighton Hospital and helped build new nurses' homes. But it wasn't just about treatment. There was a need for entertainment too. And in 1915, the wealthy cigarette manufacturer Bernard Barron, who is here in the top row, and his wife held a party for 750 wounded soldiers in St Anne's Wells Gardens in Hove. But despite the Jewish community's obvious efforts to help in the war effort, these could be difficult times for people with foreign ties or who lacked British citizenship. An example here is Abraham Dudkin. He was born in Russia, but by his early 20s he'd moved to Britain and set up as a furrier in Brighton. By 1912, he'd switched to running a chain of photographic studios, perhaps taking advantage of the spread of new technology. As a Russian national, Abraham would have been exempt from military service at the start of the war. However, as the need for soldiers grew, compulsory conscription was brought in for British men in 1916, and this in turn led to calls for non-naturalised Russians to either enlist or be repatriated. And it was against this background that Abraham was naturalised in January 1916. As a married man with a family and approaching 40, it may be that Abraham preferred to be naturalised rather than being sent to Russia. And ties to Germany could be a problem even from the wealthy. On the left, we have Leonard Messel. He was part of the Messel banking family, who were originally from Germany. However, a branch of the family had been long established in Sussex at a place called Nyman's, which is a country house near Horsham, now owned by the National Trust. Leonard was born in Britain and was in the Army Reserves before the war. However, his German roots meant that he was not allowed to serve abroad, and the same applied to his younger brother Howard, who enlisted in the Royal Sussex Regiment but was not allowed to the front. Instead, Leonard trained soldiers for the Kent Regiment, known as the Bus, while his wife Maud, on the right here, set up a nursing home in the nearby village of Balcombe. However, despite the Messel's contributions, anti-German rumours circulated about the family. And I think it's well known that the war brought far-reaching social changes across society as well, and I'll touch on a couple of these. So it's worth remembering that at the time of the war, no woman could vote, and 40% of men were disenfranchised. And all the people we studied, around 60% would not have been able to vote in the 1910 general election, which was the last one before the war, either because of their age, their citizenship, or their sex. But clearly not everyone was happy with that situation, and two of those who campaigned strenuously against it were Edith and Israel Zangwill, who are on the centre and the left here. And at the time, they were living in the seaside village of East Preston, and they had campaigned for many years for women's right to vote. And so they would presumably be pleased when, after the war ended, voting was extended and to some women over 30, and the overall size of the electorate tripled. If you were with us earlier today, you may have heard the talk about Jewish arts and culture, where Israel Zangwill was also mentioned as an early Zionist, and the fact that the question of a Jewish homeland was important to the Brighton and Hove Jewish community is underlined by the minutes of the Middle Street Synagogue here on the right. So in 1917, the Foreign Secretary Alpha Balfour had written to Lord Rothschild declaring sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations. And the text of this Balfour Declaration is copied into the Middle Street minutes in full. And the council members were moved to write to Balfour to thank the government for its sympathetic interest in the Jews. So as the end of the war came, it was greeted with joy by many, and Hove threw a large Peace Day party for children, attended by Alderman Barnett Marks. However, those who lost relatives in the war and in the flu epidemic that followed had more sombre feelings too, and the Sussex towns embarked on a programme of memorialisation that would last into the early 1920s. So just to summarise some of our findings from this project, I think we can say that the Jewish community was fully engaged in the war effort, sending soldiers to fight and providing support on the home front. In some ways, the community's experience was distinctive, particularly for those who had German relatives, and some were exposed to anti-German or anti-Semitic sentiments. And as well as the losses during the war, the period brought a degree in modernisation and democratisation, and it's contributed to the post-war changes in the composition of the community and its extension from the heart of Brighton along to Hove. I'll finish by thanking all our volunteers and partners and funders, and especially our wonderful volunteers, which you can see here, hard at work. I've only had a chance today to mention some of the people that we looked at, but there's more on our website, Shalom Sussex. Our information will also be added to the southeast section of the website. We Were There Too, British Jews in the First World War. And I believe Alan Fell is talking about that project next week. And also some of the individuals like the Messels and the Stearns and the Montefiore's feature in something called the Jewish Country House Project, which is run between the Oxford University and the National Trust. So I hope that's given you some insight into our findings, and very happy to answer any questions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diana. That was most interesting, particularly for me, because my late husband's family, his father, grew up in Brighton, and his grandfather was a tailor, probably amongst many, many Jews in Brighton at the time. So I think we'll have a look at the questions first for Anne. And Howard has asked a question, Anne. Was any klezmer music ever included in the Eastbourne repertoire?
I didn't come across klezmer at all, really. Maybe it was something a bit like Yiddish, where people sort of felt they were moving on, and they gave up some element of their past, and maybe it was considered, I don't know, not modern enough. Who knows? But I didn't actually come across klezmer musicians, no.
Right. And was pantomime part of the Eastbourne scene? Have you looked into that at all?
I haven't looked deeply into pantomime, but I'm sure it was. And I know that the Cecil Sapseed Band every Christmas did their own little pantomime and dressed up in sort of frilly dresses to entertain the children. So yes, I'm sure pantomime was strong.
Right. And how about music hall?
Oh, music hall. Yes, you can talk for a long time about music hall. There were lots of Jewish artists passing through Eastbourne and performing. So I mentioned August van Been, who was really cross when the audience didn't listen to him as much as he hoped, and he called the Eastbourne people brainless idiots, and he said, "I'm not going to come back," but he did come back quite a few times. But there were some great Jewish performers, Jews who dressed as ancient Egyptians doing magic. There was a famous Begani troupe who were called Lunatic Bakers, and they did juggling with their feet, which was called Risley. So music hall was a very big scene, and there were lots of Jews who changed their names, but maybe trading on their exoticness. And it's a really underdeveloped area, I think, Jews in music hall, an underdeveloped area for research.
I mean, very often in the seaside towns, there was entertainment on the pier. You know,
yes.
Have you come across anything like that?
Oh, yes. The pier had its own theatre and was used extensively, yes.
Mm-hmm. Well, perhaps you can do a lecture on that for us at some time.
Yeah, and I'll promise to sort out the technical stuff by then.
All right.
Yes.
Very much. Does anybody else in the audience have another question for Anne that hasn't come onto the chat? Right.
Did the major dance bands come to Eastbourne, said Tony, because I know, Tony, you have such expertise in dance bands. Yes, I think they did. There was one weekend where Gerardo played, Max Jaffa was there, I think the same weekend. There was so many Jewish connections. So yes, they did.
Joe Loss was there in about 1945 because the shop was open and Grandpa was serving, and 3 of the boys from the band came in, and he got chatting to them, and he called upstairs to Grandma and said, 3 more for Sunday lunch. And that was our family.
Oh, that's fabulous.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Anne.
Thank you.
Some questions for Diana. Question from Claire Ray. Her grandpa, Jack Sawyer from Brighton, served in the First World War. He was wounded on the Somme, and he spent the rest of World War I in a prisoner of war camp. And I don't know whether you've come across the Sawyer family, Diana, in your researches, but funnily enough, I've come across them in my St. Anne's researches, because Reg Sawyer was very involved in the housing association in St. Anne's when it was being set up, and he was on that committee, the Jewish Housing Association. I don't know, Claire, whether you were aware of that, but that's just cropped up for me.
I hadn't, wasn't aware of the Sawyer family. I'm not sure if they're mentioned on the memorial tablet, but that would be worth looking at. That's very easy to search because all the memorials are all digitized and available on the web under the Imperial War Museum. So we could easily have a look at that. There's also the We Were There Too site, and you can either put in your family's name and see if someone has already put in some information about them, or if you wish to, you can add in information about people's war service. And it's also at the moment really easy to look up more details about people when people served through the National Archives website. So normally, if you want to, you can search their website, but you have to pay if you want to see the digitized version of the records. But at the moment, because of COVID and because you can't go to the National Archives, it's all free. So if you are interested, it is possible to follow it up that way as well.
Thank you, Diana. And Claire has just put on the chat that Reggie Sawyer, who I just mentioned, and Jack, her grandfather, were brothers. So it was obviously the same family. I noticed a photograph, Diana, of the Marks' son's grave. It was taken by somebody called M. Crook.
Yes.
And I do recall that my late father-in-law's best friend was a man called Harry Crook in Brighton, who was an estate agent. I don't know whether you've come across that family at all.
It is possible. So the person who took that photo was Michael Crook, who has done a lot of research there, and it is possible that Harry was a relation of his. I was interested that you mentioned your family were tailors, because of course that was a very useful skill in the war period, and Michael's family also included people who were tailors. And when the younger sons enlisted, they went into what would become the RAF, and they were helping make planes, because at that time sewing was a useful skill for putting the planes together, because the technology was so underdeveloped at that time, or at such an early stage.
Did your project cover World War II as well, or does it stop at a certain point?
It was no, it just looked at the World War I period, because it followed on from the centenary celebrations of World War I. There were a whole lot of projects all over the country about World War One. So you know, I'm afraid we didn't look any further than that. And you can see that I think in Anne's project, you're talking about the development of different communities along the coast after the First World War, and that's something that you see more of in Worthing and Bognor Regis and so forth. There's more established Jewish communities develop in the 20s and 30s.
Do we have any more questions? Well, at this point, I'd just like to thank our two ladies for really, really interesting talk. I feel I've been at the seaside and I've also been at the front. So thank you for making it a very, very interesting evening. And just to remind you that your next treat will be on Monday, when Jane Warner, who has been one of the Connecting Small Histories team, will be speaking on My Somerset Journey with Maya Jacobs. Jane has had a wonderful time researching this man. He's almost become the other man in her life. And our second speaker is John Cowell, and his title is Unfortunate Incidents in the Life of Southport Jews. And this is based on his marvelous book that he has just published on the history of the Southport Synagogue. And I think you will find lots of stories in there that you will find really, really interesting. So next Monday at 6 o'clock, two fascinating lectures, My Somerset Journey with Maya Jacobs and Unfortunate Incidents in the Life of the Southport Jews. I hope you've had a very good evening, and thank you very much indeed for participating in the festival.